Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, this is lecture number 4 in the course on folklore studies. In this lecture, we would try to explore the presence of folklore in South Asia and the intellectual exploration of folklore in South Asia, what kind of perspective becomes prominent emerging from these engagements with folklore in South Asia. We know from some of the previous lectures we have learned that in the context of South Asia, the study of folklore ever since the beginning was restricted to the study of the classical texts of Sanskritic culture, classical texts which belonged to the textual traditions in South Asia. It was terribly, one can say that it was engagement with folklore was terribly conditioned by the perspectives inspired and informed by the classical texts. Some of the folklorists may see a dramatic divide between classical textual tradition and folklore, and some may also suggest a continuity. This issue has been a focus of various debates. Moreover, folklore studies in South Asian context went beyond the classical texts too, but it is debatable whether going beyond alone demarcates the immune boundaries of the folk, and whether relation of folklore with other parts of textual tradition ceases to exist when folklore goes beyond the classical tradition. In South Asia as elsewhere, there has been a great deal of focus on oral narratives, dance, forms, rituals and practices. The onset of dynamic work in folklore started in South Asia in around early on. It was mostly about the descriptive studies of folklore in almost synchronic manner, in a manner which was frozen in time and space. It did not look at the dynamic, the changing nature of folklore, but sometime later in 20th century we begin to see engagement with dynamic nature of folklore, when contemporary ethnographers started their research on a variety of topics from oral narratives to performative aspects of the oral culture in the context of both sacred and profane, so and so forth, interventions of market, interventions of industry, manipulations by state, all those issues began to appear as crucial in the engagement with folklore. Earlier, as I told you, the focus was just on the rural culture during the colonial times, the colonial work, ethnological practices, documentation, early anthropological explorations. There has been an evident shift in the post-colonial and contemporary times with more attention to the performative aspects, and the shift has also been in the domain of doing away with the binaries between rural and urban or traditional and modern. Moreover, the attention to folklore has been bipolar by and large as far as perspectives, theoretical orientation, conceptual orientation is concerned. On one hand, we tend to see a reading of the functional role of folklore in society. For example, how folklore constitute the domain of social, how is it instrumental in the socialization of folk into stereotypical roles. While this is a very dominant way of engaging with folklore in most of the works that we come across in the region of South Asia, there is the other variety available too. We also come across a good amount of interest on how folklore reveals the inherent social contradictions along the lines of inequality, injustice, and therefore a call for emancipation and transformative politics. In the latter part, in one of the later lectures in this course, we discuss singularly as to how folklore could be site of cultural subversion, and that takes care of particularly this second part, second kind of perspective approach to folklore in South Asia, whereas the first kind of perspective and approach would be discussed here in this lecture. The first kind being mostly about exploring the functional value of folklore in South Asia, basically to see as to how folklore helps in the maintenance, sustenance of social order. It creates a sense of integrationist role of folklore, so to say, and it is in that regard that folklore also becomes tool for various other kind of agencies, including state and market. The most popular and pervasive and also conventional has been this social integrationist perspective toward folklore in South Asian contexts. Our purpose here is not to give details about this perspective or any other perspective, any other theoretical methodological position. That would be done in one of the lectures later on, where we have primarily theoretical discussion. Here the idea is to see as to what kind of folklore were looked at from such a perspective. If we engage with the quest of folklore in the colonial South Asia, we get a sense of such kind of exploration of folklore aplenty, such kind of folklore which would appear very strongly, so that it could help the power to be to classify the folk for administrative purposes. And later on in post independent India, it would help the power to be to classify folk and their lore, so that they could be marshaled toward what we heard was called nation building program. And much later, when citizen also became consumer, when market interventions became very crucial, we also find out that folklore, part of folk, part of lore, folklore in general, were marshaled to serve the consumers in the free market economy, so to say. To begin with, the folklore studies in the colonial period started in the late 19th century with the ethnographic projects on Indian culture undertaken by the British administrators that became part of the Indian census reports too. It was an exciting revelation that someone like Bernard Cohn, underlined the relation of a purely administrative exercise of census dipped in political agenda. To know and administer the colony, it almost gave official legitimacy to the way the folk and their lore was to be seen. The colonial literature on folklore is confined to the stereotypical image of rural India, the rigidity of rural and urban divide, a conceived immutability of the traditional institutions. It looked like anything related to the colonial India was not subject to change unless a well planned transformation was ushered in by the techno-legal and administrative bureaucratic agencies. It seemed folklore itself would not have something inherent as far as inclination to social change is concerned. Mistakenly, however, the discourse around colonial times in understanding was associated with viewing India as a caste society typical of Hinduism, or if Hinduism connotes a political propaganda of elite Hindus, one can also say it was caste society in relation with the religion of the people known as the Hindus. The main objective behind such projects was to facilitate smooth administration through their understanding of the social and cultural lives of the native people of India. Indian scholars also started undertaking such ethnographic works on the Indian culture, folklore, belief systems, etc., associated with Indian caste system. Though motivated to highlight the socio-cultural distinction of India and its tradition, these native responses only fed into the larger prevalent framework. All such attempts were unlike a reading of traditions that was characteristic of a renowned documentation by an eminent historian such as A.L. Basham, and that documentation was known as the wonder that was India. One can recall the discomfort that Basham had on the title of his book, since he was aware of the delimiting connotation. Since his wondering about India encapsulated the details of heterogeneity even in the religion of Hindus during the Vedic age. Basham was keen to show with due details the difference, for example, between the Aryan inclination in the Rig Vedic Hindu Dharma and the Sham Vedic or and Atharv Vedic description and details about the practices of within Hindu Dharma. Rig Vedic emphasized on ritual performances in one way, Sham Vedic in another, Atharv Vedic in another. It was in Sham Vedic descriptions that one comes across the relation of religion, folklore and people. And because of by the virtue of this relation of religion, folklore and people, we get a sense as to how the religion of the Hindus has been far more performative beyond the regulations and prescriptions of select group of priests. Priestcraft nonetheless, there has been intersections of folk and their lore in the religious and ritual practices. Song and dance, performance and people, pure and pure, all seemingly come together in the Atharva Vedic and Sham Vedic time. Besides, the gods and goddesses have been changing too, if not entirely, partially. And this all is captured very nicely in a very riveting discussion by A.L. Basham. Unlike Basham's reading of fluidity, the colonial recording and the native scholars' responses brought about a sense of rigidity. The Orient comes into existence not in Basham's act of wondering, but in more officially normativized way of seeing the folklore in colonial South Asia. The studies undertaken by the Britishers led to Orientalist understanding of folklore of India. Orientalists' ways of explaining Indian civilization have compartmentalized India into one type of rural society characterized only by Hindu Sanskritic religion and also a rigid social structure. The Indologist Sir William Jones' work also reflects folklore's study in India. According to him, India as a society is characterized by the Hindu religious belief systems whose underlying philosophy is omnipresence, wisdom and goodness of God. According to in a very old documentation by someone called Sehelgal, way back in late 19th century, perpetuated flagged this idea about Indian culture characterized by belief system that is totally segregated from the worldly assets. and the union with God only matters. All such reflections aided to the construction of India as a mystical entity, as if utterly disconnected with the rational world. In fact, India's culture appeared to be in a negative light towards the end of the colonial time, and this was in spite of the fact, in spite of the intellectually formulated nobility that was attached to India in the Indologists, Orientalists readings of various texts and traditions. Someone like Max Muller, despite being Indophile, in his works such as the Sacred Books of the East and India, What It Can Teach Us, this kind of titles of the work, and yet it appears that India's mystical belief system is a non-rational system for Max Muller, and whatever reactions we hear from the native scholars, it only reaffirmed the anxiety about the lack of rationality, even though it was by the virtue of showing rationality in an allegedly non-rational belief system. This all created an essentialist sense in which most dominant expression was the institution of caste. This essentialism is further reflected in viewing India's culture as irrational, mystical, rural and primitive, traditional, and now we have added indigenous. And therein comes the role of folklore to be viewed as an instrument in the sustenance of irrationality, immaturity and mystical make-believe. Any intellectual crusade against this amounted to showing rationality, maturity and history in mythology. And thus crusades could not set the epistemological fallacy right. We have heard of such crusades several times. A historian like Radha Kumar gave us very good description of how during what is hailed as the time of Bengali cultural renaissance, many of the torchbearers of social reform were hesitant to deal with folklore. Why? Because it was considered to be impure, dubious source of knowledge, misguiding the folk, and that shows very well as to how the native responses were on one hand of this kind, which subscribed to the larger construction of folklore being source of impurity, superstition, bad practices, and therefore they should be pushed aside. One should exorcise the folk of their lore, so to say, in that kind of approach. On the other hand, there were also approaches which violently, forcefully tried showing that you see all this folklore, all these mythologies are very rational and therefore they can be good replacement for modern documented historiography. That too was a reaction of some sort, which was trying to safeguard folklore or maintain the esteem of folklore, but only by perpetuating the distinction between folklore and modern historiography. Folklore in the post-colonial South Asia, however, began to appear differently due to the intervention of something we have heard of in social sciences as fieldwork based reasoning and approaches. One can read an engagement with folklore at various stages of intellectual history in sociology and anthropology, as well as in history and literary, performance and culture studies in various parts of South Asia. Needless to say that we have also understood about the crisis that grips social sciences in various parts of South Asia. Crisis in the sense that there has been perpetual Eurocentrism in spite of certain kind of rhetorical attack on Eurocentrism. in various parts of South Asia, and one can count only a few such as India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, so on and so forth, we do not see social sciences really coming out of something which was declared as regional malaise of third world, and that was Eurocentrism. And in spite of that perpetuity of Eurocentrism, we however also have certain kind of silver lining, so to say, and therefore we get to see very different kind of refreshing kind of engagement with some of these folklore, folk materials, without succumbing to plain and simple case of Eurocentrism. One can read an engagement with folklore at various stages of intellectual history, as I told you. There comes a particular stage when we hear of a Sri Lankan anthropologist, Gananath Obesekere, writing along with Gombrich a work on Buddhism. Furthermore, Obesekere presented to us more focused discussion on the ritual performance in Kataragama in Sri Lankan context. And in all these works, you hear folklore informing the anthropologist. Mythology was a mainstay of anthropological discussion, and it began to occupy central stage very early in the antecedents of the disciplinary practices. Another anthropologist, Stanley Tambaya had therefore proposed the unison of Indology and anthropology and sociology, which is applicable for the whole of South Asia as well as for India. This unison was precisely with this understanding that Indology was the first ever systematic documentation, systematic production of knowledge about this part of the world, and hence anthropology dealing with this part of the world, society in this part of the world cannot afford to be uninformed by the Indological sources. This was a premise for the discussion which the French anthropologists Louis Dumont and David Pocock started in the journal, which was called, and even now it is called in a different avatar though, but even now it is called Contribution to Indian Sociology. And the discussion in Contribution to Indian Sociology was titled For a Sociology of India, that explored the possible approaches to Indian society. And in those discussions, as well as in many responses to them from sociologists and anthropologists in India, we get a sense of engagement with the traditional resources for knowledge construction. It was inclusive of reading mythology and folklore, but a clarion call and subsequent methodological discussion unfolds with what is considered to be a shift from book view to field view. The fieldwork based engagement with folklore thus assumed centrality. It was in that wake that a sociologist and anthropologist such as M. N. Srinivas and his works became important. Needless to say, there were criticism about the formulaic ways of fieldwork that came from some of the sociologists at Lucknow University. For example, a sociologist like A. K. Sharan was of the view that empirical research need not be formulaic, and that a technical exercise called fieldwork cannot help beyond a point. And today probably is very difficult to dismiss Sharan's criticism of fieldwork, because fieldwork has also become a fetish, and just like everything, all kind of methodological apparatus associated with fieldwork are equally like fetish. Every now and then we hear as almost as lip service the phrase participant observation without anyone really dealing with the intricacies of participant observation. Intricacies of participants observation is either forgotten or taken for granted safely, and therefore, it all appears like fieldwork is that magic charm. If you do that, then you are safe as a legitimate seeker of knowledge. Yet anthropological engagement with fieldwork was unrelenting. A whole lot of focus on village became central for purely intellectual and anthropological reasons, as well as for sociological contribution to the nation building program in post independent India. If Dumo looked at mythology and folklore from Tamil Nadu, later S.C. Dubey engaged with village to ascertain the status of progress. S.C. Dubey's work on Karimpur village is one of the benchmarks in not only village studies program, but also to see as to how sociologists' approach to village could be very conducive for the development programs that state would like to devise and implement. If one anthropologist rushed to Tanjore village to debate about the structure of caste and status, etc., another went ahead to see the possible classification of cultural processes, and so forth. Robert Redfield had divided village and non-village civilization into little tradition and great tradition, and Milton Singer explored the changes in traditional society along these classifications. About this, we have more detailed discussion in the later lectures in this course. For the time being, we move ahead and we see how M. N. Srinivasa's study of social system of a Mysore village entailed a field work to discuss the organization of castes and occupational caste division, along with the celebration of festivals which also reflect the strict hierarchy among the caste groups. And we would hear that for all practical purposes, the discussion on caste hierarchy is actually being informed by folk practices, folklore, notions which are there in the worldview of the folk. Caste hierarchy in the village is maintained through food practices, and therefore, we realize that even food practices become part of an anthropologist's anvil of analysis, scheme of analysis. Why? Because food practices get support and sustenance, and they are steeped in folk culture. Food practices that run because of the purity and pollution belief systems associated with the caste in India. For instance, an individual from one caste can drink water only from a certain caste group, otherwise it would result in pollution. Despite the strict division in terms of the caste organization in village, there has been also a sense of unity that prevails in the village structure. It is a unity through certain kind of ritual practices, but it is also unity through other means, such as the entrance of the village is made in such a way that the whole village could be united irrespective of their caste affiliations. Internally divided, but from outside it would look united, and this is the kind of structure that M. N. Srinivas unfolds through his work for us. The entrance to the village is not supposed to be marked. The village is also to have a temple of goddess who could drive away any form of epidemic from the village, and thereby serving all the villagers across caste groups. Any form of epidemic would not know the distinction of one caste from the another. There is also a popular belief running in the village that the body of men and women suffering from leukoderma should not be buried, as it results in drought, and such notions will be followed indiscriminately by people from across the caste groups. There has been a lot of discussion, critical discussion about the way and the kind of implications that emerged from M. N. Srinivasa's anthropological engagement. One also understands that the binary of purity and pollution itself, or higher and lower caste, may get problematic if one gets into the, if one depends on the details of various kinds contesting, showing us the contestation from within. Getting back to Cohn again, Bernard Cohn, who would give us a detailed idea about the changing status of a depressed caste. He would throw light on the practices adopted by the lower caste in the Indian caste hierarchy within Hinduism, and he would show as to how lower caste group would seek to rise in terms of their status. It would underline various ritual practices that would be adopted by these lower caste groups to come on par with the higher caste. And he would focus on the lower caste group called Kamars, who adorn the sacred thread, Yagyopavita, Janevu, that the Brahmins wear to, and they would do so. Kamars would wear sacred thread to be on par with the Brahmins. Apparently, Kamars also underwent great deal of changes in terms of their other kind of customary practices. For example, they changed their diet and their occupation. Education also played an important role in helping them raise their status. Moreover, they were trying to do away with their own distinctive religion and engage in the process of what was considered an important part of social change. This whole details of Cohn presented a challenge to Srinivas's idea of Sanskritization, which basically meant lower caste emulating the ritual practices of the upper caste to come up to that level. However, that level is an elusive level, and nobody knows whether one achieves that level. Nobody knows whether those who are from upper caste would also have that level of, higher, imagined elusive higher caste level. Most of the domestic ceremonies of the Kamars reflected the ceremonies of the higher caste, such as those of the Thakurs and the Brahmins. For instance, the previous practice of sacrificing pig was replaced by cutting of nutmeg. The cult of the Kamars, that was called Pankon Peer, has been done away with, and so forth. These kind of studies help us understand that folk contexts, cultural contexts are not frozen, non-rational exotic blocks. There is a benefit from this kind of lens of purity versus pollution, higher caste versus lower caste, benefit in the sense that it helps one arrive at the social structure of that time, but there are also certain kind of limitations. Perhaps a sense of limitation began to appear right during those days, and therefore, one began to seek for a more nuanced understanding, even though the larger framework did not change. We realize that the larger framework here has been of structural functionalist kind, where social order, social integration and the maintenance of certain kind of harmony in society is at the top of consideration. That may not change entirely, but more nuances were added, as someone like Milton Singer discussed in that famous work which was titled When a Great Tradition Modernizes. It perpetuates the old binaries, but in the meanwhile it also opens up the possibility to see the interaction between the binaries, and this is discussed in greater detail in the latter part of this course in one of the lectures. And likewise, we have also discussed in the latter part of this course, and which needs to be flagged here, that Malcolm Marriott's study, famously known as Village India, was based on the conceptual tool borrowed from Robert Redfield, and it was meant to present an analysis of the peasant communities. And the focus there was to understand the extent to which village community can be construed as an isolated unit immune to all kind of forces of changes coming from outside, whether it can be done. He looked at the village community in a village called Kishangarhi in Uttar Pradesh, and in that work he tried comprehending the village community as little tradition in the domain of communication between the little tradition and the great tradition. He came up with the understanding his understanding of processes of social change in that context. He called those processes of social change, about which we learn in more detail in the later part of this course. He called them universalization and parochialization. And in addition to these kind of development, we also have someone like Go, who would take forward from Srinivasa's theorization and would try to show that villages would no longer be united due to the advent of an industrialization. The boundaries of social relation would expand, and Go would furthermore also examine the depth and the strength of caste institution in villages, which is actually receiving all kind of influence, which is getting furthermore strengthened because of the influences coming from the outside world. Here in this whole discussion, what we have done is to make sense of what many of the anthropologists, sociologists and folklorists have tried doing in their own way, and that is to debate whether folklore could be considered entirely separated from the rest of the world. Moreover, one should go on discussing a little more about this particular way of approaching folklore. One can recall a very interesting work with ravishing details coming from the empirical context that an anthropologist such as William Sachs presented. In various of his works, we come across the references to this study. However, Dancing the Self is very important monograph which puts together almost everything from that Garhwal context, showing the performance called Pandav Leela and the intricate details of that performance. And through that performance, we get a lot of inferences, a lot of argument, and in the middle of all those things, what is very important for us to recall here is the performative creation of a reality. This reality is connected to the social, cultural, political and religious fabric. One gets a sense of the interconnections of this reality. The ritualistic religious performances in Pandav Leela in the Garhwal region of the Himalayas underscores the novel creation of self with variegated identities. The community identity revolves around one's caste allegiance. The caste identities in the performances tend to perpetuate the caste hierarchy. Moreover, we get to understand the relationship of ideology and power as reflected in the portrayal of the characters in the folk performances. Equally significant is the emergence of gender identities in these performances, which emphasize the ideas of masculinity and femininity. The Pandav Leela performance among the Garhwals comes down to the extreme categorization of the good and bad women, the typical stereotypes. These portrayals reflect in the dramatization around the characters of popular goddess from Hindu pantheon, such as Kali and Lakshmi. For example, Kali as a goddess has been portrayed as uncontrollable by any man, except a special man who can have some association in similar kind of temperament, some association with the goddess. However, Lakshmi is a consort of the Narayan, a passive goddess of prosperity. Sachs says, and I quote, many scholars have seen this distinction as evidence of a deep-seated split or contradiction in Hindu conceptions of femaleness, with sexuality, blood and pollution on the one hand, opposed to chastity, purity and self-control on the other. The split model also comes to play a role in Garhwal region. It shapes the relations between men and women. The models of Kali and Draupadi determine the socio-cultural and folkloric discourse on sexuality. Sachs refers to the comparison that the elderly maternal Kunti from the epic Mahabharata is associated with motherhood, sexual modesty, nurturance and especially virtue, while the dangerous and sexually active Draupadi, once again a very important character from the epic Mahabharata, is explicitly identified as Kali and is sometimes the recipient of dramatic blood sacrifices. In the Pandav Leela performance, these two characters of Kunti and Draupadi are of the foremost importance among all other female characters, and hence their portrayal depict the constructions of gender among the Garhwals. There have been several other anthropological engagements with folklore in South Asia. In, say for example, a famous work by Jonathan Perry on Death in Banaras conjures a folk world par excellence. This world is easy to name as Banaras, comprising the notions and rituals, ideas and practices, performance and various other things which should be included in a folk world view. Along with the binaries and binary relations that exist between sacred and profane, Perry sought to show a complementarity in the funeral practices on the ghats by the bank of the river Ganga. As it seems, folklore in the context of South Asia, as elsewhere, have seldom been divorced from religion. It seems the intricate relation between religion and folklore itself becomes a site of meaning making, and it invites a great deal of anthropological attention across time and space. Following an idea of unity between great and little traditions in the context of Sinhala Buddhism, Gananath Obesekere elucidated as to how Theravada Buddhism and the ordinary Sinhala people's Buddhism in Sri Lanka could be seen in the light of certain kind of interaction. More detailed discussion on this would appear in one of the later lectures in this course. It would also give us ideas about the distinctions within each of these kind of religious civilizational practices. Suffice to say, for the time being, that Obesekere's discussion on Theravada Buddhism helps us realize that some of the key categories which are available in the documented, textualized body of work that is called that Theravada Buddhism has, those key categories also find a new lease of life when they are discussed, talked about, spoken of, referred to in popular discussions of the people out there. Say for example, the idea of salvation itself may have varied connotations if one refers to the textual tradition, and if one refers to that non-textual performative kind of discussions that one hears of. And if this all looks too detached from cultural politics and very well embedded within the socio-religious framework, one ought to be thinking of a scholar such as Susan Reeds, who gave us very unusual, exceptional discussion on the politics and poetics of dance in Sri Lanka, a folk dance, and that disclosed the molding of identity through dance forms, famously known as traditional Kandyan dance, which has been celebrated by various people across the board and which is also very dear to state in Sri Lanka. That has been actually a bone of contention between the Tamils and the Sinhalese in Sri Lanka while asserting their ethnic identities. But more than that, it has been bone of contention amongst Sinhalese, Sinhala Buddhists themselves, because on one hand Kandyan dance takes them to their roots, which can be spelled out as Roots. On the other hand, Kandyan dance also give them a sense of roots, which can be spelled out as Routes. Kandyan dance, therefore, is not a monolithic, exotic, frozen entity in past. It has acquired all refreshing novelty, which has the potential of making it popular with people. It is just like another example from India of a folk dance festival. It is called Bihu in Assam, and Bihu in Assam, which may have multiple formations across ethnic groups. Each formation, each Bihu performance belonging to a particular ethnic group would be staking its claim in pure Ahomia identity, and thereby we find an interesting kind of polyphony that we hear in the wake of a folk festival, folk dance performance, inclusive of singing and dancing and dressing up and eating out. The details of this kind of folk festivals give us clear idea that in spite of the broader orientation in structural functionalism and an interest in understanding as to how folklore can sustain social order, one ought to be taking it with a pinch of salt that folklore is unchanging, folklore is static, folklore is an immutable tool, societal tool to govern society. It has been going through changes, and at the sight of changes we also realize the involvement of varied agencies. In the same breath, one shall read Margaret Mill's work on verbal performance in Afghanistan, which underlined gender reinforcements through folklore. The research on oral narratives in Herani, Afghanistan, enables the discussion to revolve around domestic storytelling. The content of stories varies between men and women. The content of oral narratives of women focused more on issues surrounding domestic issues and around antagonism with relation to kinship after marriage, whereas the male counterpart were more interested in the domain of talks around acquisition of wives. The tonality is also different for both the genders. This is a very fascinating observation. Why? Because the reason why it is important in our discussion, because it gives us a sense that some of the contemporary engagement with folklore is along these lines which were not so prominent early on. And particularly talking of Afghani context, where Islamic version of patriarchy is prevalent alongside ethnic divides, it becomes important to see as to how gendered relations could be central in women's folklore. Likewise, one remembers Narayan Rao's work in India in the context of folk epic in Telugu that revealed patriarchal values centered around marriage and passive status of women, more so among the higher caste, whereas much superior or relatively superior roles of women among the lower caste group. In an exciting work on storytellers, storytelling and stories, all three integral components in folk tradition, someone like an anthropologist like Kirin Narayan brought together various stories told by the sadhus. The functionality of these oral narratives, as the sadhus, the storytellers would stress, are to continue a certain kind of ideology around Hindu religion. Although such folk narratives of these sadhus do not particularly imply caste related concerns, prejudices of caste invariably creep in along with the politics of religion. It may not be intended, but there is always a covert function that these oral narratives serve as far as the caste and religion prejudices are concerned. Moreover, in most of the stories told by storytellers, the sadhus are mostly men, and a sense of patriarchal ideology also seems to reflect in the stories. For example, in the stories which is called the Sadhu and his loin clothes, and another one which is called Falling In, women were portrayed in terms of their sexuality, sexual orientation, their role primarily being in alluring the sadhus and bringing them back into the world through their sexual charm. It is like suggesting that these women are sexual source of sexual distraction, which can deviate a renouncer, world renouncing sadhu from the path of from the supreme path. In some of the stories of Swamiji Sadhu, a particular sadhu, as Kirin Narayan informed us, women appeared with wit and wisdom too. However, in most of the stories, the misogynistic attitude towards women reigned supreme. For example, the Swamiji's reference to women was in comparison to gold, that both women and gold can distract an honest man from his real goal and path in life. While some of these details coming from social scientific engagement with folklore are important and suggestive of folklore in conjunction with societal norms and practices playing important role in the sustenance of sociability, sociality and social system. There are other kind of examples which would give the flip side of the coin. It would suggest as to how folklore is about subversion of identities. A more focused discussion on folklore as the site of cultural subversion and the nature of that cultural subversion will appear in the later lecture in this course. Here we can very briefly flag them so that we are reminded of some of these flagged issues in the later lecture too. One could think of a monograph by Gloria Goodwin Raheja, which was called Listen to the Herons' Words, and that will be discussed in later lectures too. that monograph emphasized the subversive tactics associated with the rendition of the folk songs in the northern India. Through women's songs, one can decipher what women want, and it's reflected in the form of the social imagination which exposes the expected behavior. The heron in this work is obviously a bird which is known for ambiguous meaning to both masculine and feminine traditions of folklore. In masculine tradition, it is more associated with a negative, deceitful character. In the context of female folk songs, however, herons are evoked to understand women's lives. And likewise, the divide of men's and women's folklore, particularly folk songs in Uttar Pradesh and Rajasthan, also shows this kind of gendered divide. Elsewhere, a folklorist like A.K. Ramanujan gave us an idea of the Akam and Puram songs, one being associated with the genre of songs which are sung by men, the other being associated with the genre of songs sung by women. Women's genre is primarily reflective of love, intimacy, and the interpersonal relation based issues in domestic sphere, whereas men's songs would be mostly about the triumphant in the world, the pursuits of material goals in the world, etc., etc. With these divides, however, the song's subversive tendencies can be seen in their resistance to the passive nature of women that has been considered as stereotypical imagination, the extreme categorization through which women are perceived as either sexual or one with all material traits and hence motherly. Such songs, such folklore also offer a great deal of critique of the split roles of women as daughter, wife, daughter, sister, and as a wife. Women's songs refute the dominant perception about women being either sexually active or one with motherly traits. These songs portray a set of women who are both sexually indulgent and possess all the traits of being motherly as well. These women pay a visit to their lover's house in the night. The new mothers simultaneously play the role of a wife with all the erotic traits for her husband. Daughter and sister at their natal home can be without veil, whereas while they are at their in-laws' home, they are supposed to be in veil. This signifies how women are torn between their natal and conjugal relationship in terms of role performance in the under the larger ambit of kinship. However, in the songs, women demonstrate the possibility of doing both. There are also folk songs that depict resistance of women to the portrayal of women as character like Sita from the epic Ramayana. These women refrain from accepting their fate and believe in getting things done in their own way. A scholar such as Sarah Lamb has given a remarkable body of work listening to women's voices, and she has also heard subversive voices of women by adding a subaltern touch in the narratives of abandoned women. She has provided us a novel sense of understanding about motherhood, as mother and mother-in-law revolves around various tales. Looking at various tales which she has heard in Vrat Katha, she would come up with tales such as Debu's Ma. In her ethnographic works, we get to hear these tales, and through these various tales, the scholar Sarah Lamb would offer us interesting kind of observations about the breakdown of relationship between mother and child, the debate on mother-child reciprocity, abandonment of women, elderly women, their pathos and their woes, and the kind of counter argument which would emerge from these tales, arguments which will resist the larger patrilineal understanding of women folks world. Raheja and Gold have also discussed something called negotiated solidarities. A repertoire of such alternative solidarity poses resistance to the official ways or the dominant discourse around the patrilineal kinship. Likewise, one can think of women singers in Kangada who reflect on the idea of separation from their husbands. Their songs called Pakharu highlight the absence of the male members in women's lives and the varied form of emotion they go through due to the absence of their husbands. These and many other songs create a larger panorama of folk worldview, suggesting that acceptance of stereotypical role is just one part of the story, subversion is another. We will rest this case here in this lecture. Thank you.